people understand the concept of moving thousands of miles away from home for better opportunities when it's an influencer heading to LA.
I'm doing it. I'm moving to LA to be an influencer.
But when it's an immigrant crossing a border for survival, suddenly it's a criminal. We all share this earth, so why does your right to move depend on the passport that you were born with? Let's uncover that.
I remember my grandparents' stories, all of them European migrants who arrived in Argentina beginning of the 20th century, when the American continent received 55 million Europeans. As far as I knew, all of them took their own decisions, forced by their circumstances, and also having to face a huge challenge in their destination countries, but without having to ask a special permit or authorization to do so. So what had happened?
Migration is one of the oldest human behaviors, and yet one of the most judged and restricted today. If a French national moves to Vietnam, they're called an expat. If an influencer is moving to LA to follow their dreams, they're just living their best life. But if an Indian moves to Germany for work, they are called an immigrant. If a boy from Ghana crosses the Mediterranean on a boat to reach Italy, he is called a refugee or worse, an illegal. But if we think about it, essentially they are all doing the same thing, moving from one part of the earth to another in the search for better opportunities, safety, or to follow their dreams. But somehow each of these stories is treated completely differently. Some people are welcomed with open arms, their visa processes are extremely easy or there's no need for visa at all, and no one questions their intentions. Others have to prove that they deserve entry, with hundreds of pages of documents, the right amount of money in their bank account, and endless waiting at the mercy of cold bureaucratic systems, which maybe soon will be AI-powered. And some people, those with the fewest options, risk everything. They walk through deserts, they cross dangerous waters. If they survive, they might be detained, and that sadly can be the best-case scenario. And of course, there are nuances to every story, but this is the general truth. Some humans are given more rights than others because of the place that they were born. Citizenship ends up mattering more than humanity. So in this video, I want to explore that, the tension between migration and citizenship and the discourse around migration in the past years. What it means to move and the incredibly difficult experience of living in another country, which I know firsthand. Let us not only save the birds, let us follow them. Let them teach us how to live with the seasons again, how to move when movement is needed, how to stay without clinging, how to belong without borders. Craig Santos Perez. Human beings have always moved to follow water, food, safety, or seasons. Long before the idea of countries and passports, movement and migration was a natural response to changing environments. It was an act of survival, while the concept of citizenship and the borders that uphold it is relatively new. Only a couple of centuries ago, your identity and rights were tied to religion, tribe, or allegiance, and not rigid lines drawn on a map. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked a turning point. Governments concerned with spies, draft evasion, population control, and many other things began implementing strict travel restrictions, identity checks, and documentation systems. So passports transformed into tools of state surveillance. It's a way to monitor loyalty and regulate movement. So migration was no longer just a human act, it became a bureaucratic one. And after World War I, the collapse of empires like the Russian and the Ottoman created millions of stateless refugees. And the League of Nations responded in the following way. They hosted passport conferences, for example, the one in Paris in 1920, to standardize travel documents, introduced the Nansen passport in 1922, which was a travel document for stateless people, and established legal frameworks for dealing with statelessness and forced migration. So borders as we know them today were born out of wars and fear and not out of any natural human need. In theory, citizenship is a legal status, but in practice, it's like a lottery ticket, because you can't choose where you're going to be born. but it determines what rights you have, where you can go, and what kind of life you're allowed to live. So yeah, most people acquire citizenship through birth. The countries have either jus soli, which is rights of soil, you're a citizen of where you're born, or jus sanguinis, or right of blood. You're a citizen based on your parents' citizenship. And that's it, you're locked into a legal identity based on pure luck. Legal scholar Eilert Shachar calls this the birthright lottery, an unearned advantage passed down through generations, much like aristocratic titles or inherited wealth. In a deeply unequal world, citizenship becomes a global caste system. If you're born, for example, in Germany, Canada, or Japan, you inherit rights, protections, freedom of movement, and many other advantages. But if you're born in Syria, Sudan, or let's say Afghanistan, you inherit barriers, suspicion, and statelessness. This inherited privilege shapes access to education, healthcare, safety, and mobility. And despite the myth of globalization, the vast majority of people will never be able to change their citizenship. Harsha Valia says in her book Undoing Border Imperialism, "Butterflies have always had wings. People have always had legs. While history is marked by the hybridity of human societies and the desire for movement, the reality of most of migration today reveals the unequal relations between rich and poor, between North and South, between whiteness and its others." Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman brings another dimension to this topic, calling the modern world liquid. According to him, institutions, jobs, identity, and even borders are in constant flux. But in this liquid world, mobility is power. And unfortunately, not everyone has it. In liquid modernity, elites like corporations, billionaires, and even to some extent digital nomads can cross borders freely. But the working class, the poor, the displaced, they're stuck in place, heavily policed and heavily excluded. He further talks about deterritorialization, wow, I pronounced that word amazing, and dislocation. According to him, traditional bonds between identity and geography are slowly dissolving. Work, culture, relationships float between spaces, especially across the digital space. And due to that, people lose a sense of home, not just physically, but psychologically. And in this context, nations start losing sovereignty to global markets, and people lose stability to precarious work. And because global economy demands flexibility, we have gig jobs, short-term contracts, endless relocation. The old identity of I'm a factory worker from this town is gone. And what remains is constant economic anxiety and existential uncertainty. And Bauman argues that this dislocation is structural. Because when nothing stays solid long enough to build a coherent life, the freedom to move becomes a burden unless you already have power. So from all of these scholars, we can conclude several things. First of all, today, the accident of your birthplace determines what rights you have. For example, an Italian citizen can enter around 190 countries visa-free, while an Afghan citizen only around 25. So essentially, passports have become global caste markers. In theory, all humans are equal, but in practice, your humanity is weighed against your nationality. And all of this becomes even more complicated in the context of the current globalized world and the liquid modernity, where capitalism demands you to be flexible and fluid to survive and thrive. Let the birds teach us again how to move when movement is needed, how to stay without clinging, and how to belong without borders. To go further, nowadays there's another dimension to migration, which is linked to climate. As extreme weather events escalate, so does displacement. More and more people are not migrating just because they want to, but because they have to. But instead of being welcomed as victims of the crisis that they didn't cause, they are met with fences and detention. Meanwhile, the actual architects of the crisis fly first class, carbon heavy, and across borders without any issues. Essentially, the countries that are most responsible for the current climate crisis are not paying the price. The wealthy, industrialized nations emit the vast majority of greenhouse gases. Yet it's the global south that suffers the consequences, which we can clearly see with endless droughts, cyclones, and crop failures. And as the tropics become hotter and less habitable, the planet's climate sweet spots are shifting northward to Canada, Scandinavia, Russia, and the Arctic Circle. This means that these regions, many with shrinking population and aging demographics, will need to rethink infrastructure, governance, housing, and many other things. And this is essential not to just sustain the current residents, but also to welcome millions of more. Climate migration is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and it's calling for a lot of nations to rethink how they view immigrants. In Nomad Century, the science journalist Gaia Vince makes this extremely necessary argument. Mass migration is not a crisis to prevent, it's a reality to prepare for. Vince frames the 21st century as the nomad century, where mobility becomes a survival strategy in a destabilizing world, a moral imperative for global justice, and a planning challenge that we must embrace and not resist. She argues that instead of clinging to the outdated ideas of static citizenships and fixed nations, we must build a world that supports movement ethically and sustainably, and most importantly, compassionately, without deportation orders and detentions.
The more immune you are to people's suffering, that's very, very dangerous. It's critical for us to maintain this humanity.
Very often we need stories to understand what is truly going on behind concepts and words thrown around like migrant, refugee, nomad. And that's why I thought it would be very useful to look at a few stories and kind of create this human connection apart from all the theory that we discussed. And the first story is actually mine. So I thought it would be perfect to open up and tell you firsthand what it's like to be a migrant. So I've spent most of my conscious, independent life ever since I was 17 as a migrant. And maybe a little bit of a background. I was born and raised in Armenia. I am fully Armenian, but I was sent to a Russian school where we did not learn Armenian history or Armenian language. So I already had this disconnection between my true Armenian identity and what I was taught about Russian history and needing to be patriotic about a country that I had no real connection to. And that's thanks to colonialism that made me feel like I didn't quite belong anywhere. And that's why I relate so much to what Zygmunt Bauman wrote. According to him, in liquid modernity, identity is no longer given by class, religion, or nationality. It must be constructed, curated, and constantly updated. It's like a personal brand. And this leads to a lot of anxiety because in this shifting world, the identity, the self-identity never feels fully finished. And that was my experience exactly. So because I was so brainwashed into thinking that I had a Russian part of identity in me, at 17, I moved to Moscow to study international relations in a university that I really wanted to study at. And yeah, going to Russia just felt like a logical step. Living in Moscow, don't get me wrong, it was super exciting. It's an amazing city, but it never felt quite right. It never felt like I really belonged there. Then during my exchange semester in Lisbon, I experienced something new. This feeling of freedom that you have when you live in less patriarchal and less conservative societies. So I liked it so much that I moved to Italy for my master's and then to Berlin for work. And everywhere I went, I carried a suitcase and a huge pile of documents that I always needed to apply for visas in order not to miss deadlines, to be present at appointments. So all my life, it's been a never-ending pile of paperwork and visa anxiety and uncertainty about where I'd be in 6 months. I can never be fully relaxed and free and enjoying my present because I always have to think several steps, several months ahead. If I want to do a part-time job, I need to apply for a part-time permit and gather all the necessary documents. If I want to do freelance, I need to apply for a freelance visa and again prove that I will be able to survive and that I have people that want to work with me. And if I don't do any of that in time, I'll just lose my visa and I'll have to go back to Armenia, which at this point, even though it's my country, I don't feel like I belong there either. It gives me this feeling of being provisional and in constant transition. I'm living in Germany now, but I don't feel fully free. I can't open a business for my YouTube channel. I can't legally freelance. I'm tied to a job contract. If I want to stay, I can't rest, travel, or volunteer freely. I can't just exist. And yet this is still considered a relatively successful migrant story. I speak multiple languages, I always integrate relatively well, I have a degree, but even with this privilege, I live in constant low-grade anxiety. So if this is one of the best case scenarios for someone coming from a less privileged country, what happens to everyone else? What about people who don't speak the language or who flee war zones or they don't have legal pathways, support systems, or degrees? I thought a very powerful example was told in the film Io Capitano, I the Captain. I watched it in Italian, so I don't know.
Si jamais tu conduis le bateau, tu t'emmènes toi et ton ami.
Je suis pas capable de conduire ces grands bateaux-là. Il y a beaucoup de personnes, il y a des vies, il y a des enfants.
C'est nous. Lo xew.
Dama la dama gis sama yaay. Dama bëggoon gis sama yaay ne ko mu baal ma àq. Dama nam sama yaay. Mu baal ma àq yàlla tax. Capitano!
It's based on a true story, and it shows the journey of two teenage boys from Senegal who try to reach Europe, or specifically Italy. Their journey involves human trafficking, desert crossings, violence, exploitation, prison-like detention camps in Libya. They're so young, but on the way they see death. They're in a constant survival mode, and it's honestly heartbreaking to watch and so sad to see how the system treats them as criminals when they're just two teenage boys trying to survive. I wouldn't want to spoil the film for you, but I would definitely recommend watching it. It's a powerful story. Apart from it, there are so many other refugee stories that need to be told and need to be heard. So I will link some in the description below.
Aujourd'hui, je suis réfugiée. Ce qui me manque le plus dans mon pays, c'est la liberté que j'avais. J'étais libre, je marchais, je faisais ce que je voulais, sans contrainte, sans rien du tout.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are expats. They are often white, Western, middle class, and mobile. They move to Lisbon, Bali, Tbilisi. You can often see them with their laptops in cafes. They rent Airbnbs, post travel plus productivity TikToks, while driving up local prices. Often entire neighborhoods get gentrified while locals get priced out. On one hand, it's undeniable that they come with a lot of privileges, with the right citizenship that allows them to spend several months in the designated country without needing to apply for a visa, with a degree and a job that allows them to earn enough money to live the life that they desire, with savings, which is also always a privilege, and just a better perception in the eyes of the local authorities and the local people. On the other hand, even for them, things aren't always easy. The promise of remote freedom comes with a lot of throwbacks. They face several traps like digital nomad scams, targeting naive newcomers, financial instability, burnout, and alienation, and many other limitations.
Here's the truth about moving abroad without romanticizing it. The truth is that making friends as an adult in a new city is hard, and even if you meet people you like, you'll feel lonely sometimes because when you're starting from scratch, it's easier to build one-on-one connections than a big friend group. The truth is that you'll be alone a lot of the time and be forced to learn how to enjoy your own company.
However, just going back home feels difficult. For people that flee war zones, going back means possible death. For others, it may feel like failure or isolation. Speaking from my own experience, I often think, why don't I just return to Armenia? And maybe at some point I will. But for now, first of all, I don't feel like I belong there either. I don't speak Armenian well enough to work professionally, even though that can always be worked on. I don't relate to many of the cultural and societal norms that I find outdated. I've become foreign to my own homeland. But here in Germany, I'm not exactly welcomed either. I exist somewhere in between. I'm legal but limited, integrated but insecure. And always navigating what I'm allowed to do next, not what I want to do. So I stay because I've built something here, a small community of friends that I care about, a routine that I don't want to leave because of the potential and because millions of others don't get the chance to try.
Today, our cities are flooded with illegal aliens. Americans are being squeezed out of the labor force.
In the recent elections across the world, there has been a surge in anti-migrant rhetoric. Even though a lot of parties technically target asylum seekers or undocumented migrants, the fear spills over all migrant groups: students, workers, researchers, families. Overall, the lines blur quite fast when politics are traded in such panic. Politicians start using painfully familiar messaging like they take our jobs, they abuse our welfare systems, they make our streets unsafe. These are textbook scapegoat tactics. They are often used when political systems are under pressure, whether from inflation, housing shortages, or insecure labor markets. It's much easier to blame the outsider than to confront structural issues. Sociologist René Girard wrote that societies often look for a sacrificial victim during moments of crisis, a scapegoat to symbolically absorb all the chaos. Migrants have long played that role. It's happening in Germany with very clear examples from the election period at the beginning of 2025. It's happening in the US. Trump blamed Haitians, Muslims, and Mexicans for crime and disease. The UK, under the Conservatives, rolled out a surreal deportation plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda as if trauma can be outsourced. France cracked down on Algerian and sub-Saharan youth, fueling cycles of marginalization. And Italy, under right-wing leadership, routinely turns back boats fleeing Libyan hellscapes, knowing full well what waits behind. And it's a strategic move to use migration as a political tool. It's like an emotional shortcut to voter anger. It helps to temporarily conceal real issues like housing shortages, low wages, health crisis, inflation, and austerity. And this creates a never-ending cycle because when migrants are scapegoated, they face marginalization. This leads to more surveillance and more criminalization. And facing marginalization and criminalization means that a lot of them often face rejection from employers and are isolated within the society, which drives them further into the tunnel of criminality, because that's the only option that they have left. They get stripped of context, humanity, and they just become statistics in the news headlines about crime or unemployment. It's a vicious cycle. Fear, scapegoating, marginalization, criminalization, social friction, and more fear. And guess who benefits from that chaos? Of course, the right-wing parties. And there's another point that I'd like to touch upon regarding the right-wing parties, and in this case, climate migration. The parties that scream the loudest about migrant invasions are often also the ones that block climate initiatives. Right-wing platforms typically center around two main things: anti-immigration stances and weak or non-existent climate action. But these two positions are deeply interconnected when we look at it through the lens of climate justice and migration. What this means is the following. The less you do to stop climate change, the more the global climate crisis intensifies, and the more people are displaced by floods, droughts, and famine. Then the more people are forced to migrate, and as a result, the more migration pressure your own country will face. Climate change is a huge driver of displacement, especially in the global south, where resources to adapt are often lacking. According to the IPCC, climate impacts will force tens of millions to leave their homes by mid-century. So here's a cruel twist. Governments that refuse climate action are actively fueling climate migration flows. And guess what? They will probably later use it as a political tool. It's like setting fire to the house and then building walls to keep out the people that are fleeing the flames. And this is incredibly convenient and even serendipitous for many political forces, because guess what thrives in chaos and insecurity? Right-wing populism. It usually gains momentum during economic downturns, rising insecurity, social fragmentation, and often it's all blamed on migrants and not the systems that created the conditions. And whether it's accidental or not, it's extremely detrimental to the humanity. Well, it's been a long video, and to conclude all of this, I want to read the words of Gopal Dayaneni. Migration is an earth right. Monarch butterflies don't migrate across the continent because it's fun. Species migrate because the conditions are no longer conducive to making home in place, and they will migrate to a place where the conditions are more conducive. We as humans also migrate like birds, like seeds, like wind. We do it for love, for safety, for security, for a better life. Migration is not a threat. It's a rhythm of life. The earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. So whether you're labeled as an expat, a refugee, foreign student, a dreamer, you all belong here because the earth belongs to all of us. That's how I also found my identity, by the way. I'm just an Armenian girl that belongs to the earth. Just a little speck on this giant rock that is floating in space. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you have a similar experience, and what do you think about migration? I know that some of the ideas that I shared can be considered radical or very idealistic, but it's all a starting point for discussion and improvement. So let's talk about it. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye!